Thank you very much for inviting me to give a very brief talk here for History Hub on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. I will do that very concisely. I've only been allowed 20 minutes to talk to you about this vast subject, but I will do my best to offer some reflections on the place of the Second World War in the general history of the 20th century, but also more specifically about the memory of that conflict and how it speaks to us in the present. 80 years ago, the most destructive war in history approached its end. World War II truly lived up to its name. It was a global conflict that pitted the Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, China and their smaller allies, against Germany, Japan, Italy, and a few other Axis nations. Some 70 million men and women served in the armed forces, taking part in the greatest military mobilization in history. Civilians, however, did most of the suffering and dying. Some 66 million people perished over the course of that war, some 70% of them civilians, including 6 million murdered Jews, murdered during the Holocaust. Tens of millions more were uprooted from their homes, many of them living as displaced people for years to come. The war's after effects were as staggering as its scale. It laid the groundwork for the world we've known for 8 decades, from the dawn of the nuclear age to the creation of Israel, to the emergence of the United Nations, but also the United States and the Soviet Union as the world's 2 competing superpowers during the so-called Cold War. Yet it is also worth remembering that there was not one but several world wars. The war was experienced very differently in Latvia and across the Eastern Front more generally than it was in, say, France or in the United States. War was also not immediately followed by a period of peace, as is often suggested in the dominant Western narratives that divided the 20th century quite neatly into a violent first half and a more peaceful, prosperous second half. This strict categorization makes limited sense in Eastern Europe, where violence continued on a smaller but by no means insignificant scale after 1945. This was not just true for Greece, which experienced a very violent civil war in the later 1940s, but also in the Baltic region, where guerrilla warfare against the Soviet Union continued well into the 1950s. In the very limited time that I have available, I would like to reflect briefly on 2 interconnected questions that have been on my mind and indeed on the minds of many historians working on the 20th century. Firstly, what exactly was the place of the Second World War in the wider history of extreme violence in that period? And secondly, I would like to reflect a little bit on how we can explain the extreme nature of that violence that characterized the Second World War. Processes that have been called recently processes of civilianization and paramilitarization of warfare. All of that despite the various attempts since the late 19th century to civilize warfare. I think it is impossible to answer either of these 2 questions that are of course connected without reference to the First World War, which quite rightly has been emphasized by George Kennan many years ago as the great seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, without which very few of the subsequent developments, from the rise of Bolshevism to the rise of fascism, or indeed the Second World War, can be properly explained. So in trying to explain what happened over the course of the First World War that enabled some of the issues that were also underpinning the Second World War, I'd like to point to 2 macro-historical developments. The first of these is the crisis of the European land empires and disagreement about the future direction of politics and society. What I mean by that is that over the course of the 19th century, obviously there were major socioeconomic changes, from urbanization to industrialization in some parts of Europe, but also open land questions and isms of different guises that created the potential for revolution. But really it was the First World War, broadly defined, that was to become the unintended enabler of imperial crisis and eventual collapse. So we have to bear in mind that up until 1914, Europe was very much a continent of empires, both land empires such as the Russian, Austro-Hungarian or Ottoman empires, but also the blue water empires of Britain, France, and many other countries. That world of empire had come under strain and under pressure from various national movements before 1914, but it was really the Great War that enabled the national revolutions, which fundamentally altered the map of Europe more profoundly than had been the case at any stage in the modern period, as you can see from this map. With that began a prolonged process of ethnicized violence against minorities within the emerging nation states that had already been the case during the First World War. From 1917 onwards, however, an additional element fueled the fires of highly ideological warfare, and that is the actualization of social and national revolution, as well as the ideological confrontation between Bolshevism and its enemies. Between 1917 and 1920 alone, Europe experienced no fewer than 27 violent transfers of political power, many of them accompanied by armed conflicts. The most extreme case, of course, was the former Romanov Empire, which imploded and where hostility between the supporters and opponents of Lenin's Bolshevik coup in 1917 rapidly escalated into a civil war of historically unprecedented proportions, claiming millions of lives. The Bolshevik Revolution is so important, I think, for what is happening in Europe in the following decades, because 1917 unleashed both a renewed sense of possibilities and a keener, though often ill-defined, sense of threat. Many people either felt inspired by the Russian Revolution, or they felt that this was such an enormous danger that it had to be fought, even in countries where a communist revolution was not really on the cards. So what this propelled was a series of conflicts in Eastern and Central Europe, stretching all the way from Finland in the north to Greece in the south, which basically shook Europe between 1918 and 1923, when these smaller conflicts that weren't actually that small, small only when seen in comparison to the First World War or indeed the Second World War, came to an end. However, while open wars did not occur again until the 1930s, the conflicts of 1917-18 to 1923 left a durable legacy of unsettled scores and a wider culture of violent rhetoric, uniformed politics, and street fighting, often with the aim of controlling public spaces. As a range of scholars have shown, the politicized, militarized men who had frequently been affiliated with paramilitary groups at the Great War's end became the central component of the shirted movements of interwar Europe that profoundly changed the language, rhetoric, and practice of politics. These shirted movements of men, and in fewer cases of women, quite literally wore their beliefs on their sleeves in the form of armbands and proclaimed the efficacy of violent action over words, anticipating in many ways the paramilitary movements that fed into the violence of the Second World War. Spain, of course, in 1936 then became the first major international conflict where violence erupted openly. And it involved a large number of international volunteers who saw the Spanish Civil War as a conflict that was much larger than Spain, that was actually an international conflict in which the forces of communism and fascism clashed. And what is interesting here is that you see a lot of movement of people, volunteers, fighting either for the Republic or for communism on the one hand, but also a lot of international volunteers who supported the cause of General Franco. And many of these people then turned up again in the Second World War, either as members of the resistance or indeed as supporters of fascism in the crusade against Bolshevism. This in turn, I think, helps to better understand the nature of violence in the period and the cycles of vindictive violence that carried over into the Second World War. During the conflict that began in September 1939, most nation-states in continental Europe were shattered, occupied, and/or divided, creating once more spaces for violent clashes between rival political projects for the future to escalate, often with the active encouragement of the occupiers. As a result, notably after 1941, there was not just the big war, the Second World War, there was also a whole series of interlinked armed conflicts that played out in different ways in different local contexts. In many of the Nazi-occupied territories, for example, inter-community violence escalated between German-sponsored local police formations and pro-Soviet partisans. In all partisan operations across Nazi-controlled Europe, non-German auxiliaries, often with their own agendas and scores to settle, played a crucial role with similar patterns of violence and retaliation across the occupied territories. And what is important to note, and I pointed to this at the very beginning of my lecture, is that it helps us to understand why, particularly from an Eastern and Central European perspective, the Second World War did not end neatly in 1945, just in the same way as it didn't end neatly in 1918. So this chronology, the idea that the First World War began in 1914 and ended in 1918, and that the Second World War began in 1939 and ended neatly in 1945, is very much a Western narrative. It is one that makes a lot of sense for, say, Britain, but it doesn't make a great deal of sense for many countries in Eastern Europe, where paramilitary conflict, resistance, armed resistance against the second occupation, the Soviet occupation, continued for many years. This is a period after 1945 that sees the uprooting of many people from their homes, basically being forced to resettle, be they German, be they Poles, the redrawing of borders, and also the creation of a new post-war order that in many cases was not as peaceful as is often suggested in the Western narrative of the Cold War. And again, I think the civil war in Greece is yet another very good example that disrupts this narrative of a neat transition from war to peace in 1945. And this actually leads me to my final point that I'd like to make in this very brief lecture. The way in which the war ends has in many ways also impacted on the way in which it is remembered. Obviously, in Western Europe, was for a very long time. People thought about 1945 much more in terms of liberation rather than the beginning of a second occupation. And this posed a number of problems after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, when politicians across Europe tried to find a kind of unifying narrative about the Second World War. And the minimum consensus on which people agreed was that the 20th century was a very long period of shared victimhood in which people suffered from different totalitarian regimes, be they communist or be they fascist. And I think that is actually quite intriguing and underscores the point that the ways in which the war was remembered in East and West was fundamentally different. But there's also one other thing that struck me about memory, and that is in Eastern Europe, and the picture the first picture on the slide behind me will be, of course, familiar to audiences in Riga, is that the two world wars were always thought together in a way that was not the case in Western Europe. In Germany, where I was born, certainly since the 1990s, the First World War was very much a forgotten war. And it really was only during the centenary of that conflict in more recent years that people have pointed to the origins of the Second World War in the First World War once again and tried to reconnect them in a way that I think was always much more present in Eastern Europe. Whereas in Germany, of course, certainly from the 1990s onwards, it was the memory of the Holocaust. And here behind me, you see the memorial of the murdered Jews of Europe in the center of Berlin that was established in the early 2000s, which became the central focal point of memory in connection with the Second World War. So what and how we remember the Second World War was and remains always tied to places and different national cultures of remembrance. For a long time, it seemed like the memory of the Second World War was waning. With the passage of time, public awareness of the war and its almost unfathomable consequences has faded, becoming as dim as the colors of an old photograph. Obviously, that has changed now with the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, where suddenly in the news we're talking about places that to those of us with historical consciousness of the Second World War ring all too familiar. At the same time, this is a pivotal moment to talk about memory and the Second World War because first-hand witnesses are dwindling in number. According to some estimates, less than 1% of people who witnessed the war as either soldiers or civilians are still alive, and that number is rapidly declining as we are talking about people who are now in their late 90s or even in their hundreds. It is likely that this is the last major anniversary to be witnessed by survivors.